Case 1. Brandi Worley, the Divorce Day Massacre. The date was November 17, 2016. In the quiet town of Darlington, Indiana, a place where everyone knows everyone and tragedy feels impossible, a father's worst nightmare became reality. Jason Worley had just done something difficult but necessary. After years of a deteriorating marriage, he'd finally filed for divorce from his wife, Brandi. The couple had 2 beautiful children, Tyler, a bright-eyed 7-year-old boy, and Charlie, an energetic 3-year-old girl who lit up every room she entered. Jason loved his kids more than life itself, and as the marriage crumbled, his focus became protecting them and ensuring they'd have stability through the transition. That night, Jason went to sleep in the basement. It was an arrangement they'd made during the separation period, maintaining separate spaces in the same house until the divorce could be finalized. He had no idea that while he slept, his wife was making a decision that would destroy multiple lives forever. In the early morning hours, Brandi Worley walked into Tyler's bedroom. Her 7-year-old son was sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about Pokemon or Minecraft, the things kids that age dream about. Without hesitation, without mercy, Brandi stabbed her own son repeatedly with a knife. Tyler fought. The evidence would later show he tried to defend himself. But he was a small child, and his attacker was his own mother. He had no chance. After killing Tyler, Brandi moved to 3-year-old Charlie's room. The little girl was still sleeping, completely unaware that her brother had just been murdered feet away. Brandi stabbed Charlie to death in her bed. The toddler who had called her mommy and trusted her completely never woke up to understand what was happening. Then Brandi did something that still chills investigators to this day. She calmly walked downstairs, picked up the phone, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Brandi's voice was eerily flat, disturbingly calm. "I just stabbed myself and I killed my 2 children," she said. The dispatcher, trained for emergencies but never truly prepared for something like this, tried to process what she was hearing. "You killed your 2 children?" "Yes," Brandi replied, as casually as if she were ordering pizza. When police arrived at the Worley home on West Lincoln Street, they found a scene of pure horror. Both children were dead in their beds, surrounded by blood. Brandi had superficial self-inflicted wounds, clearly an afterthought, possibly an attempt to create some kind of defense narrative. But there was no defense for what she'd done. During questioning, Brandi told investigators exactly why she'd murdered her babies. Jason had asked for a divorce. He wanted to take the kids. And in Brandi's twisted logic, if she couldn't have her children, he couldn't either. She'd rather see them dead than see them happy with their father. "I didn't want him to have my kids," she told detectives, as if this explained everything, as if this made it reasonable. The community of Darlington was devastated. Neighbors described the Worleys as a normal family. Nobody saw this coming. Tyler's classmates struggled to understand why their friend wasn't coming back to school. Charlie would never reach her 4th birthday, never start kindergarten, never experience any of the joys of childhood. Jason Worley's life was shattered in ways most people can't imagine. In a single night, he'd lost both of his children and his wife. Not to an accident, not to illness, but to an act of pure evil perpetrated by the person who was supposed to love them most. Brandi Worley was charged with 2 counts of murder. Facing overwhelming evidence and her own confession, she eventually pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced her to 120 years in prison, 60 years for each child, to be served consecutively. At her sentencing, there were no tears from Brandi, no remorse, no explanation that could make sense of the senseless. Brandi Worley is currently incarcerated at the Indiana Women's Prison. She will be eligible for parole when she's over 100 years old, which means, barring some extraordinary medical advancement, she will die behind bars. Tyler and Charlie Worley will remain forever young in photographs, their potential unfulfilled, their lives stolen by the person who gave them life. Some cases haunt investigators for years because they're unsolved mysteries. The Worley case haunts investigators for a different reason, because it was solved immediately, because there was no mystery, because a mother simply decided her children were possessions she could destroy rather than share. If this case affected you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Hit that notification bell because we're going to continue examining cases that demand to be remembered, no matter how painful they are to hear. Case 2. Caylin Opal Marie Monroe, forgotten to death. Some murders happen in moments of rage. Others unfold slowly, day by day, through willful neglect. The death of 3-month-old Silas Monroe falls into the second category, and in many ways, that makes it even more difficult to comprehend. It was February of 2022 when emergency responders were called to an apartment in Indianapolis. They arrived to find an infant boy who was severely malnourished and unresponsive. Despite their best efforts, Silas Monroe was pronounced dead. He was only 3 months old, barely long enough to have lived, certainly not long enough to have smiled his first real smile or recognized his mother's face consistently. The cause of death was starvation. A 3-month-old baby had starved to death in 2022 in the United States of America, in a home with a mother who was alive and capable. Let that sink in. Caylin Opal Marie Monroe was Silas's mother, and investigators quickly determined that his death was no tragic accident or medical mystery. This was a case of extreme neglect, so extreme it crossed the line into murder. During the investigation, police discovered something disturbing. Caylin had been instructed by medical professionals to keep a feeding log for Silas. This wasn't unusual. Feeding logs help track whether babies are eating enough, especially if there are concerns about weight gain or health issues. But Caylin's feeding log told a horrifying story. The entries were sparse, irregular, and revealed a pattern of chronic neglect. There were huge gaps in feedings. Caylin later admitted to investigators that she would often forget to feed Silas. She said that when he was quiet, she assumed he was fine and didn't bother checking on him or offering him a bottle. Think about that for a moment. Caylin interpreted her baby's silence, likely the silence of weakness and approaching death, as a sign that everything was fine. Any parent knows that infants cry when they're hungry. They're supposed to cry. It's their only way of communicating their needs. But by the time Silas stopped crying, it was because he no longer had the strength to cry, and his mother interpreted that silence as permission to continue ignoring him. 3-month-old babies need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. Their stomachs are tiny, their caloric needs are constant, and missing even one feeding can leave them distressed. Missing multiple feedings over days causes severe problems. What happened to Silas wasn't forgetting one bottle. This was systemic, sustained neglect. Friends and family who were aware of the situation later told investigators they'd expressed concerns about Silas's care. Some said they'd noticed he seemed underweight or that Caylin didn't seem attentive to his needs. But nobody intervened in time to save him. At trial, prosecutors painted a damning picture. This wasn't a struggling young mother who was overwhelmed but doing her best. This was a person who fundamentally failed to meet the most basic requirement of parenthood, keeping your child alive. The feeding log, her own admissions, and the medical evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Caylin Monroe had essentially allowed her son to starve to death through sheer indifference. The defense tried to argue that Caylin was young, that she was inexperienced, that perhaps she had postpartum depression or other mental health challenges. But the prosecution countered with a simple truth. Millions of young, inexperienced, mentally struggling mothers manage to feed their babies. Having challenges doesn't give you the right to let a child die slowly over days or weeks from malnutrition. The jury agreed. In November of 2024, Caylin Monroe was convicted of murder and multiple counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in death. The judge sentenced her to 65 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed Caylin directly. He noted that Silas had been completely dependent on her for survival, that he'd had no ability to feed himself or seek help, and that his suffering had been prolonged and entirely preventable. The judge said that while the court couldn't bring Silas back, it could ensure that Caylin never had the opportunity to harm another child. Caylin Monroe is currently serving her sentence at the Indiana Women's Prison. She'll be in her 80s before she's eligible for parole. Silas Monroe's grave is marked with a tiny headstone that reads, "Forever in our hearts." Though one has to wonder whose hearts, exactly, since his own mother couldn't be bothered to keep him alive. The Monroe case raises uncomfortable questions about how many other children might be suffering in silence right now. How many babies are being neglected by parents who just can't be bothered to do the basic work of caregiving? And how many of those situations will end in tragedy before someone intervenes? If you're concerned about a child's welfare, please speak up. Call Child Protective Services. Report what you see. You could save a life. And if you want to stay informed about cases like this, don't forget to like this video, and subscribe to Cold Case Time for more true crime content that matters. Case 3. Sophie Igou, the Invisible Child. Some children slip through the cracks of society's safety net. 22-month-old Jasper Igou didn't just slip through the cracks. He was hidden away, kept from view, and allowed to waste away until he died from neglect so severe that investigators were shocked even by the standards of child abuse cases they'd seen before. It was September of 2025 when police were called to conduct a welfare check at a residence in Indiana. What they found inside would haunt them for years to come. Jasper Igou was dead, but he hadn't died recently. His small body was in a state of decomposition, suggesting he'd been dead for some time before anyone even knew to check on him. He was severely malnourished, so thin that investigators said his tiny frame showed signs of long-term starvation. His living conditions were appalling. The home was filthy, filled with trash and waste, unsafe for any human being, let alone a toddler. But here's what made the case even more disturbing. Jasper had essentially been invisible to the outside world. He hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year. There were no regular wellness checks, no pediatrician visits, no immunization records, nothing. For a child who should have been having regular checkups throughout his first 2 years of life, Jasper had been completely off the grid. His mother, Sophie Igou, had effectively hidden her son from any oversight. Whether this was intentional or the result of severe dysfunction doesn't change the outcome. A toddler who should have been learning to talk, beginning to run, exploring his world with curiosity, instead died alone in squalor. When investigators interviewed Sophie, they struggled to get coherent answers about what had happened. The timeline of Jasper's death was unclear. The circumstances were murky. What was clear was the evidence: a dead child, severe neglect, and a mother who had failed in every possible way to protect her son. Medical examiners determined that Jasper died from complications related to severe malnutrition and the conditions he was living in. This wasn't a sudden illness or an unavoidable tragedy. This was a slow death that unfolded over weeks or months while his mother did nothing to help him. Child Protective Services records revealed that there had been previous concerns about the household. Some reports had been filed, some investigations had occurred, but somehow Jasper had remained in his mother's care. Now advocates and officials were left asking painful questions. Could more have been done? Were there warning signs that were missed? Could Jasper have been saved if the system had functioned differently? Sophie Igou was arrested and charged with multiple counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in death. These are serious felony charges that carry decades in prison. At the time of this recording, her case is still working through the court system, but the evidence against her is overwhelming. What makes cases like Jasper's particularly tragic is that they're often preventable. Toddlers need food, clean water, basic hygiene, safe shelter, and medical care. These aren't complicated requirements. Food assistance programs exist. Medicaid provides health care for children in low-income families. Social services can offer support. But all of these resources require that someone actually seeks them out, actually cares enough to ask for help. Sophie Igou apparently never did. And Jasper paid the ultimate price. The prosecutor handling the case has stated publicly that they will seek the maximum sentence allowable under Indiana law. They've argued that Sophie's complete failure to provide for her son's basic needs, combined with the prolonged suffering he endured, warrants the harshest punishment available. Defense attorneys will likely argue mitigating factors, perhaps mental illness, perhaps poverty, perhaps addiction. But the prosecution has made clear that millions of people struggle with mental illness, poverty, and addiction, and they still manage to feed their children and take them to the doctor. Challenges in life don't excuse letting a baby starve to death in a house filled with filth. Jasper Igou never got to celebrate his second birthday. He never went to preschool, never played at a park, never had the chance to be a child. He existed in the shadows, known only to a mother who couldn't or wouldn't care for him, until his short life ended in suffering. As this case continues through the legal system, one thing is certain. Sophie Igou faces spending decades behind bars, likely the rest of her natural life. And while prison cannot undo the suffering Jasper endured, it ensures that Sophie will never have the opportunity to harm another child. If this case troubles you, and it should, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We're committed to telling these stories, no matter how difficult they are to hear, because these children deserve to be remembered. Case 4. Gertrude Baniszewski, The Torture House. We need to go back in time now, to 1965, to examine one of the most notorious and disturbing cases of child abuse and murder in American history. This case is so horrific that it's been the subject of books, films, and documentaries for nearly 6 decades. And yet, no matter how many times the story is told, it never becomes easier to process. Her name was Sylvia Likens. She was 16 years old, full of life, with dreams of becoming a model or a singer. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny were left in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski while their parents, who were carnival workers, traveled for work. Gertrude was a 37-year-old mother of 7 children, living in a dilapidated house in Indianapolis. She was poor, stressed, and reportedly unwell. The arrangement seemed simple. The Likens parents would pay Gertrude $20 a week to house and care for their daughters. It seemed like a reasonable solution. It turned into a nightmare that would end in Sylvia's death. What happened inside Gertrude Baniszewski's house over the next 3 months is almost beyond comprehension. Sylvia was subjected to torture on a scale that's difficult to describe even in a documentary format. This wasn't abuse in the conventional sense. This was systematic, prolonged, sadistic torture. Gertrude enlisted her own children, neighborhood kids, and anyone who came around to participate in tormenting Sylvia. The girl was beaten regularly with paddles, belts, and fists. She was burned with cigarettes. She was forced to eat her own feces. She was tied up in the basement and subjected to humiliation and sexual abuse. At one point, Gertrude and several teenagers literally used a heated needle to carve an insult into Sylvia's abdomen. The abuse escalated over time. What started as verbal cruelty evolved into physical violence, which then evolved into torture that seemed to have no purpose other than causing suffering. Gertrude appeared to derive satisfaction from Sylvia's pain, and she encouraged others to participate, creating a group dynamic where multiple people were complicit in the ongoing abuse. Sylvia was starved. She was denied access to a bathroom and then mocked and punished for soiling herself. She was kept in the basement, away from windows and any chance of escape. Her younger sister Jenny, who had a physical disability, was also in the house and witnessed much of the abuse but was too terrified and powerless to stop it. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Marie Likens died in the basement of Gertrude Baniszewski's home. The official cause of death was a brain hemorrhage, shock, and malnutrition. But really, she died from sustained torture and abuse that her body simply couldn't survive anymore. After Sylvia's death, Gertrude tried to cover up what had happened. She and the children who'd participated in the abuse concocted a story about Sylvia running away with boys from a local gang. They even forced Jenny to go along with the story. But when police investigated, the truth quickly emerged. The autopsy revealed over 150 wounds on Sylvia's body. Burns, cuts, bruises, broken bones, and the words carved into her skin. Investigators said it was one of the worst cases of abuse they'd ever encountered. Gertrude Baniszewski was arrested, along with several of her children and neighborhood kids who had participated in the torture. The trial that followed shocked the nation. Details of what had happened to Sylvia emerged in court testimony, and people struggled to understand how such evil could exist. Gertrude's defense tried to paint her as mentally ill, as someone who wasn't fully responsible for her actions. But the prosecution argued that her behavior was too calculated, too sustained, too organized to be dismissed as insanity. This was deliberate cruelty. In May of 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Several of the accomplices, including her own children and the neighborhood kids who participated, also received sentences, though most of them were eventually released. Here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. In 1985, after serving 20 years, Gertrude Baniszewski was paroled. The decision caused outrage. Sylvia's family was devastated. Advocates for abuse victims were furious. But Gertrude was released anyway, largely due to arguments that she'd been a model prisoner and that she was in poor health. Gertrude Baniszewski died of lung cancer in 1990, just 5 years after her release. She never expressed genuine remorse for what she'd done to Sylvia. She spent her final years in relative obscurity, using a different name. But the legacy of the Sylvia Likens case lives on. It prompted changes in how child abuse is investigated and prosecuted. It raised awareness about the dangers of group dynamics in abuse situations, where multiple perpetrators enable and escalate each other's cruelty. And it stands as a reminder that some human beings are capable of monstrous acts. Sylvia Likens would have turned 76 years old in 2025. Instead, she remains forever 16, a victim of torture so severe that her case is still studied in criminal justice courses and discussed in documentaries like this one. While Gertrude technically didn't die in prison, she was convicted of one of Indiana's most heinous crimes and served 2 decades behind bars. Her name will forever be synonymous with evil, and Sylvia's story will forever be remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when cruelty goes unchecked. If you found this case as disturbing as we did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We're covering the cases that need to be told, and your support helps us continue this important work. Case 5. Tenisha and Echols, the repeat offender. Sometimes the justice system gives people second chances. The hope is that someone who's made mistakes will learn from them, will change their behavior, will become a better person. But what happens when someone gets a second chance and then immediately wastes it? What happens when someone who should have learned from tragedy goes right back to endangering children? That's the story of Tenisha and Echols. In 2019, Tanisha's 6-month-old daughter, Darea, died under circumstances that were clearly suspicious. The baby suffered blunt force trauma and showed signs of neglect. Medical examiners determined that Darea's injuries were not accidental. Someone had hurt this baby, and someone had failed to provide proper care. Tenisha was investigated and charged in connection with her daughter's death. The case seemed straightforward: a mother who had failed to protect her child, and possibly a mother who had actively harmed her child. Prosecutors prepared for trial, expecting that Tenisha would face serious prison time. But then something unexpected happened. Through a combination of plea negotiations, legal maneuvering, and factors we may never fully understand, Tenisha and Echols avoided prison. She was placed on probation instead. Think about that. Her 6-month-old daughter was dead from blunt force trauma and neglect, and Tenisha walked free on probation. The system gave her a second chance, an opportunity to prove that she could be a responsible parent and a law-abiding citizen. She lasted 6 years. In 2025, police in Indiana were once again investigating Tenisha and Echols. This time, the allegation was that she had left her children home alone in unsafe conditions while she was out. The kids were reportedly living in filth, without proper supervision, without adequate care. When investigators arrived at Tanisha's residence, they found exactly what the reports had described: children who were being neglected, living conditions that were unacceptable, and a mother who had clearly learned nothing from the death of her infant daughter 6 years earlier. Tenisha was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child neglect. And here's the kicker: she was still on probation from the 2019 case. That means she hadn't even finished serving her punishment for Darea's death when she was arrested for endangering more children. The prosecutor handling the new case expressed frustration in court filings and public statements. They pointed out that Tenisha had been given an extraordinary break in the first case. Most mothers whose infants die from blunt force trauma go to prison, not probation. And instead of using that second chance to become a better parent, Tenisha had squandered it. The new charges carry significant prison time, and prosecutors have made clear they will seek the maximum sentence. They've argued that Tenisha has proven she's a danger to children, that she's incapable of providing proper care, and that the time for second chances has passed. At the time of this recording, Tenisha's case is still working through the court system. Her defense attorneys are likely arguing for leniency, perhaps claiming that she's dealing with mental health issues or substance abuse or poverty or any number of challenges that make parenting difficult. But the prosecution's response is simple: other people face those same challenges and don't let their babies die or leave their children in dangerous conditions. Having a hard life doesn't excuse child abuse and neglect. What makes the Echols case particularly frustrating for advocates and observers is that it represents a system failure. Darea's death in 2019 should have been a wake-up call. Tenisha should have faced serious consequences that either motivated her to change or removed her ability to harm more children. Instead, she got probation, and now more children have suffered as a result. Legal experts who followed the case say that Tenisha is now facing likely decades in prison. Between the new charges and the violation of her probation from the original case, she's looking at a sentence that will keep her incarcerated well into old age, if not for the rest of her life. The children who were found in neglectful conditions in 2025 have been removed from Tenisha's care and are now in the custody of child services. They'll grow up knowing that their mother chose to neglect them, just like she neglected their sibling who died as a baby. That's a trauma that therapy can help with, but can never fully erase. Echols never got to celebrate her first birthday. She never took her first steps or spoke her first words. She died as an infant, and her death should have meant something. It should have been a turning point, a moment of reckoning, a catalyst for change. Instead, it was just the beginning of Tenisha and Echols' pattern of failure as a mother. As this case continues to develop, one thing is clear: the justice system won't make the same mistake twice. Tenisha had her second chance. She blew it, and now she'll spend what's left of her life paying for her choices. If this case made you angry, and it should, please channel that anger into action. Support organizations that advocate for abused children. Push for better oversight of parents who've been involved with child protective services. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time, where we're committed to telling stories that need to be heard. Case 6. Keiara Bickett, the CVS parking lot tragedy. Some tragedies unfold over time. Others happen in an instant. But even the tragedies that happen quickly often have roots in negligence and poor decisions that stretch back long before the fatal moment. That's the story of what happened in a CVS parking lot in June of 2025. Keiara Bickett was a young mother with a 2-year-old son named Javarius. By all accounts, Javarius was an energetic, curious toddler, exactly what you'd expect from a 2-year-old boy. He was at that age where everything is fascinating, where exploration is constant, where supervision is absolutely critical because toddlers have no concept of danger. On that June day, Keiara brought Javarius and his older sister to a CVS pharmacy. The family was in their car in the parking lot. What happened next took only seconds, but will haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Keiara had a handgun. She kept it in her purse, and that purse was apparently within reach of her children in the vehicle. 2-year-old Javarius, curious and exploring like toddlers do, found the gun. And before anyone could react, the gun discharged. Javarius shot himself in the head. His older sister witnessed the entire thing. Keiara immediately called for help, but there was nothing anyone could do. Javarius was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were fatal. The toddler died shortly after arrival. The investigation that followed was straightforward and devastating. Keiara Bickett had left a loaded, unsecured handgun where her 2-year-old son could access it. She wasn't watching carefully enough to notice when he found it. And the result was a child's death that was completely preventable. Prosecutors charged Keiara with felony neglect resulting in death. The legal argument is clear. As a parent and a gun owner, Keiara had a responsibility to ensure her weapon was secured and inaccessible to her children. She failed that responsibility, and her failure cost Javarius' life. This case has sparked intense debate about gun safety and parental responsibility. Gun rights advocates argue that this was a tragic accident, that Keiara is already suffering the worst punishment imaginable by losing her son, and that criminal charges are unnecessarily piling on. They say she's a victim too. But prosecutors and child safety advocates see it differently. They argue that keeping a loaded gun unsecured in a vehicle with small children isn't an accident. It's negligence. They point out that gun safety education is widely available, that trigger locks and gun safes are accessible and affordable, and that every responsible gun owner knows that firearms must be secured around children. The statistics are sobering. Hundreds of children are injured or killed each year in the United States because they accessed unsecured firearms. These aren't mysterious tragedies. They're preventable incidents that happen when adults fail to take basic safety precautions. In Javarius' case, multiple safety failures came together to create a fatal situation. The gun was loaded. The gun was unsecured. The gun was within a toddler's reach. And supervision was apparently insufficient to notice when the child found it. Any one of those factors being different could have saved Javarius' life. Keiara's older daughter, who witnessed her baby brother shoot himself, will carry that trauma forever. Imagine being a young child and watching your sibling die violently right in front of you. That's the kind of experience that requires years of therapy to process, and even then, it never really goes away. The case also raises questions about how this situation even occurred. How does a parent not notice that their toddler has gotten into their purse and is handling a firearm? Toddlers aren't stealthy or quiet. They make noise, they move around, they're constantly seeking attention. The level of inattention required for a 2-year-old to access a gun and discharge it without intervention is staggering. At the time of this recording, Keiara Bickett's case is still proceeding through the courts. She faces decades in prison if convicted on the felony neglect charges. Her defense attorneys will likely argue that she's already suffering, that she's lost her son and has to live with that guilt forever, and that prison won't serve justice. But the prosecution has made clear they believe Keiara's negligence was so extreme that it crosses into criminal territory. They're arguing that the community needs to see consequences for this kind of failure, both to hold Keiara accountable and to send a message to other parents and gun owners: secure your weapons or face prison time when the inevitable tragedy occurs. Gun safety experts who've weighed in on the case say it's a textbook example of what not to do. They emphasize that firearms should always be stored unloaded in locked containers, with ammunition stored separately. They note that quick-access gun safes exist for people who want home defense options while still keeping weapons away from children. And they stress that when firearms are being transported in vehicles with children, extra precautions are essential. Bickett was 2 years old. He should be alive today. He should be starting preschool, learning his ABCs, playing with toys, and growing into a happy child. Instead, he's dead because his mother didn't take basic safety precautions with her firearm. Whether Keiara Bickett ultimately spends decades in prison or receives a more lenient sentence, one thing is certain: she'll spend the rest of her life knowing that her negligence killed her son. And Javarius's sister will spend her life remembering what she saw in that CVS parking lot. This case should serve as a wake-up call for every parent who owns a firearm. Secure your weapons. Take gun safety seriously, because the alternative is a tragedy that destroys multiple lives in an instant. If this case resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. And if you're a gun owner with children, please, please, please secure your firearms. It could save a life. Case 7. Amber Pasztor, to keep them safe. The phrase, "I did it to protect them," is something we hear occasionally in true crime cases. It's a rationalization that abusers and killers use to justify the unjustifiable. But rarely is that phrase as chilling as when it's used by a mother who's just murdered her own children. That's the case of Amber Pasztor. September of 2016. Fort Wayne, Indiana. 7-year-old Liliana Hernandez and 6-year-old Renee Pasztor were living with their grandparents. This wasn't an unusual arrangement. Their mother, Amber, had lost custody of the children, and the grandparents had stepped in to provide a stable home. Amber didn't agree with this arrangement. Despite whatever circumstances had led to her losing custody, she believed her children belonged with her. So on September 26, 2016, Amber made a decision that would destroy multiple families. She showed up at her parents' home and abducted Liliana and Renee. The grandparents immediately reported the children missing, and an Amber Alert was issued. Law enforcement across Indiana began searching for the three of them, hoping to find the children safe and return them to their grandparents' custody. But Amber had already decided how this was going to end. She'd stolen a car, a detail that shows premeditation and planning, and she'd driven Liliana and Renee to a remote area. In the back seat of that stolen vehicle, while her children were restrained and unable to escape, Amber Pasztor smothered them to death. Liliana was 7 years old. She was in 2nd grade, learning to read chapter books, probably obsessed with whatever cartoons or toys were popular that year. Renee was 6, probably excited about starting kindergarten or 1st grade, at that age where every day is an adventure. And their mother, the person who should have protected them from harm, deliberately killed them. After murdering her children, Amber drove around with their bodies in the car. Eventually, she was stopped by police. When officers approached the vehicle and looked inside, they found the worst possible outcome: 2 small bodies in the back seat. Amber was arrested immediately. During questioning, she made statements that investigators still struggle to understand. She said she killed Liliana and Renee to keep them safe. She said she was sending them to heaven where they'd be protected from the evils of the world. She seemed to genuinely believe she'd done the right thing. This is a phenomenon that psychologists call altruistic filicide, when a parent kills their children because they believe death is preferable to the life the children would otherwise live. It's a twisted logic that only makes sense inside the mind of someone who's fundamentally disconnected from reality and morality. But here's the thing. Liliana and Renee weren't in danger. They were living with their grandparents, who loved them and cared for them. They were attending school, making friends, having normal childhoods. The only danger they faced was from their own mother. Amber's defense attorneys tried to argue that she was mentally ill, that she wasn't capable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions, that she genuinely believed she was protecting her children. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Experts testified about her mental state. But ultimately, the evidence showed that Amber had planned this crime. She'd stolen a car. She'd abducted her children. She'd driven to a remote location. She'd smothered them to death. These aren't the actions of someone who's completely out of touch with reality. These are the actions of someone making choices, even if those choices are horrific. Amber Pasztor eventually pleaded guilty to murder. Whether this was because she realized she'd face overwhelming evidence at trial, or because her attorneys advised her it was the best option, or because some part of her actually felt guilty, we may never know. The judge sentenced her to 130 years in prison. That's effectively a life sentence. Amber will die behind bars unless she lives to be well over 100 years old. At her sentencing hearing, family members gave victim impact statements. The grandparents talked about the joy Liliana and Renee had brought to their lives and the devastation of losing them to such senseless violence. They talked about how they'll never get to see the children grow up, graduate, get married, have their own families. All of that potential was erased in a back seat of a stolen car. Amber didn't speak much at her sentencing. Reports from the courtroom suggest she remained largely emotionless, detached from the proceedings. Whether this was due to mental illness, medication, or simply her personality is unclear. What is clear is that two children who should be alive today, Liliana would be 16 now, Renee would be 15, are dead because their mother decided her twisted logic was more important than their lives. The Pasztor case raises important questions about child custody and mental health. Amber had lost custody of her children for reasons that were clearly valid. The system had worked in that sense. The children were removed from danger and placed with loving grandparents. But the system couldn't protect them from their mother's final, violent act. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Should there have been more protections in place to prevent Amber from accessing her children? These are questions that advocates and policymakers continue to debate. What's not debatable is that Amber Pasztor committed an unspeakable crime, and she will spend the rest of her life in prison because of it. The Indiana Women's Prison is now her permanent home, and she'll remain there until she dies. Liliana and Renee deserved so much better. They deserved to grow up, to experience all the joys and challenges of childhood and adolescence and adulthood. Instead, they're frozen in time, forever young, victims of a mother who claimed to love them but destroyed them. If this case affected you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. These stories are painful, but they're important, and we're committed to telling them with the respect these victims deserve. Case 8. Chelsea Crossland, the 74-day horror show. Content warning. This case involves extreme child abuse and torture. It's one of the most disturbing cases we'll cover in this documentary, and if you need to skip ahead, we understand. Christian Crossland was 5 years old. He should have been starting kindergarten, making friends, learning to tie his shoes, discovering what he was interested in. Instead, Christian endured what prosecutors would later describe as a 74-day horror show that ended in his death. His mother, Chelsea Crossland, subjected Christian to systematic torture and starvation in the spring of 2022. This wasn't a case of a parent losing their temper and causing accidental harm. This was prolonged, deliberate, sadistic abuse that escalated over weeks until Christian's small body simply couldn't survive anymore. The details that emerged during Chelsea's trial were almost unbearable to hear. Witnesses testified that Chelsea would beat Christian regularly. She withheld food from him as punishment, watching him waste away from malnutrition. She isolated him from anyone who might intervene or help. The home itself was described as filthy and neglected, with conditions that no child should have to endure. But it got worse. Evidence showed that Chelsea had delayed calling for help even after it was clear Christian was seriously injured or ill. There were indications she discussed with others what to do about Christian's body, suggesting she knew he was dead or dying and was more concerned with covering up what she'd done than saving his life. When emergency responders finally arrived at the residence in March of 2022, Christian was beyond help. The 5-year-old boy was pronounced dead, and the investigation that followed painted a picture of abuse so severe that even experienced detectives were shaken. The medical examiner's report was damning. Christian had multiple injuries consistent with sustained physical abuse. He was severely malnourished, showing signs of long-term starvation. His body bore evidence of the torture he'd endured over those 74 days. Neighbors and people who'd had contact with the family told investigators they'd had concerns. Some said they'd noticed Christian seemed thin or that Chelsea seemed aggressive toward him. But nobody had intervened in time to save his life. Chelsea Crossland was arrested and charged with murder and multiple counts of neglect. At trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of her guilt. They showed the jury photos of Christian's injuries, presented medical testimony about his suffering, and called witnesses who described Chelsea's treatment of her son. The defense tried to argue that Chelsea had mental health issues, that she'd been overwhelmed, that perhaps she hadn't intended for Christian to die. But the prosecution countered with the systematic nature of the abuse. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. This was 74 days of deliberate torture. The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. He described Chelsea's crimes as among the worst he'd seen in his career. He talked about Christian's suffering, about the prolonged nature of his torture, about the fact that this innocent child had endured unimaginable pain at the hands of the person who should have protected him most. Chelsea Crossland was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never be released. She will die behind bars, and that's exactly what she deserves. During the sentencing hearing, family members gave victim impact statements. They talked about Christian as a bright, loving little boy who deserved a chance at life. They talked about how they'll never get to see him grow up, never get to watch him succeed, never get to know the person he would have become. There were also angry questions directed at the system. How had this gone on for 74 days without intervention? Were there missed opportunities to save Christian? Could Child Protective Services have done more? These are valid questions, and they don't have easy answers. The reality is that child abuse often happens behind closed doors, hidden from view, with victims who are too young or too frightened to report what's happening to them. By the time the abuse becomes visible to the outside world, it's sometimes too late. But Christian's death wasn't inevitable. At multiple points during those 74 days, Chelsea could have made different choices. She could have fed her son. She could have stopped hitting him. She could have taken him to a doctor. She could have asked for help from family or social services. Instead, she chose violence, neglect, and ultimately murder. Chelsea Crossland is currently incarcerated at the Indiana Women's Prison, where she'll remain for the rest of her natural life. She's reportedly in segregation for her own safety. Child killers aren't popular among other inmates, and there's a real risk of violence against her from other prisoners. Christian Crossland would be 8 years old now if he were alive. He'd be in 3rd grade, probably obsessed with video games or sports or whatever kids that age are into. He'd have his whole life ahead of him. Instead, he's buried in a small grave, his life cut short by 74 days of torture at his mother's hands. This case serves as a reminder that child abuse is happening right now in communities across the country. Some children are suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice, hoping for rescue. If you suspect a child is being abused, please report it. You could save a life. If this case disturbed you, and it absolutely should, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We're telling these stories because they matter, because these victims deserve to be remembered, and because awareness can lead to prevention. Case 9. Chantell Gardner, left alone to die. How long can you leave a 2-year-old alone before it becomes fatal neglect? Hours. Days. What if the answer is that you shouldn't leave a 2-year-old alone at all, and doing so makes you responsible for whatever happens to them? That's the question at the heart of the Chantell Gardner case. January of 2025. Indianapolis, Indiana. Police received a call about a child's death, and when they arrived at the scene, they found something that would haunt them. 2-year-old Skylar Gardner was dead, and the circumstances of her death pointed to severe neglect. Skylar's small body was found under a dresser in the home. She had extensive bruising, injuries consistent with physical abuse, and medical examiners would later determine she died from hypothermia. Let that sink in. A toddler froze to death inside a home in Indiana because the conditions were so bad and supervision was so absent that she couldn't even keep herself warm. The investigation revealed a pattern of neglect that was staggering in its callousness. Chantell Gardner, Skylar's mother, had allegedly been leaving her children home alone for extended periods while she stayed with her boyfriend. She would reportedly be gone for days at a time, only checking in once a day, if that. Think about what it means to leave a 2-year-old alone. Toddlers can't feed themselves. They can't dress themselves properly. They can't regulate their body temperature. They can't handle emergencies. They're completely dependent on adults for survival. And Chantell was allegedly leaving Skylar and her other children alone for days while she lived her life elsewhere. When police searched the home, they described the conditions as horrendous. The residence was filthy, filled with waste and trash, unsafe for anyone to live in, let alone small children. There was evidence of ongoing neglect, lack of food, lack of basic necessities, lack of any semblance of proper care. Neighbors told investigators they'd had concerns about the children. Some said they'd rarely seen the kids outside, that the home always seemed neglected, that they weren't sure if anyone was actually living there consistently. But nobody had called Child Protective Services in time to save Skylar. The bruising on Skylar's body suggested she'd also been subjected to physical abuse. Investigators believe she was struck repeatedly, possibly beaten with objects. Combined with the neglect, the lack of food, and the freezing conditions, Skylar's final days were likely filled with pain, confusion, and fear. She was 2 years old. She probably didn't understand why her mother wasn't there, why she was cold and hungry, why nobody was helping her. She probably cried for mommy, not knowing that mommy had chosen a boyfriend over her own child. Chantell Gardner was arrested and charged with murder and multiple counts of neglect. Prosecutors have described this as one of the most egregious cases of parental neglect they've seen. They're arguing that Chantell's systematic abandonment of her children, combined with the physical abuse, constitutes murder. At the time of this recording, the case is still proceeding through the courts. Chantell's defense attorneys will likely argue that she was struggling, that she had her own challenges, that she didn't intend for Skylar to die. They might point to mental health issues, poverty, or relationship problems as factors. But the prosecution's response is clear. Millions of people face those same challenges and don't abandon their toddlers for days at a time. Having a hard life doesn't give you the right to neglect your children to death. Legal experts following the case say Chantell is facing life in prison if convicted on the murder charge. Even if the jury finds her guilty only of the neglect charges, she's looking at decades behind bars. Skylar's other siblings have been removed from Chantell's custody and are now in foster care or with relatives. They'll grow up knowing that their mother chose to abandon them and that their baby sister died because of that abandonment. That's a trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The Gardner case highlights a disturbing trend. Parents who treat their children as inconveniences to be set aside while they pursue their own interests. Skylar wasn't a priority for Chantell. She was an obstacle, something that got in the way of spending time with her boyfriend. And because Skylar was treated as an inconvenience rather than a precious human life, she's dead. Child welfare advocates say cases like this are preventable. They point out that resources exist for struggling parents, food assistance, housing assistance, childcare assistance, mental health services. But those resources only work if parents actually use them, if they actually prioritize their children's welfare. Chantell Gardner apparently never did. And now she'll spend what's likely the rest of her life in prison. And Skylar will remain forever 2 years old, a victim of maternal neglect so severe it crossed into murder. If this case made you angry, channel that anger into something productive. Support child welfare organizations. Advocate for better oversight of at-risk families. And if you ever suspect a child is being neglected, please report it. You could save a life. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We're committed to telling these stories, no matter how difficult they are, because these children deserve to be remembered and their voices deserve to be heard. Case 10. Cheyenne Hill, The Cruel Remarks. Our final case is that of Cheyenne Hill, and it's a story that encompasses severe neglect, physical abuse, and statements so callous that they reveal a level of cruelty that's almost incomprehensible when directed at one's own child. November of 2022. Indianapolis, Indiana. 18-month-old Eliana Hill was found unresponsive in her mother's care. Emergency responders rushed the toddler to the hospital, but her injuries were catastrophic. Eliana died shortly after arrival. The medical examination revealed the extent of what this little girl had endured. She was severely malnourished. Her body showed signs of long-term starvation. She had a brain bleed, indicating traumatic head injury. She had broken bones in various stages of healing, meaning she'd been injured multiple times over an extended period. She had bruising covering her small body, and she had other injuries consistent with sustained physical abuse. Eliana hadn't died from a single incident. She died from months of neglect and violence that her 18-month-old body finally couldn't survive. Cheyenne Hill, Eliana's mother, was immediately the focus of the investigation. As detectives looked into the case, a picture emerged of a mother who'd systematically failed to care for her daughter and had actively harmed her. But what made this case particularly disturbing were statements Cheyenne had allegedly made about Eliana. During court proceedings, testimony revealed that Cheyenne had made cruel remarks about her daughter's future, suggesting that she viewed the child as a burden and expressing sentiments that indicated she didn't want to be a mother. The specific statements are so callous that they're difficult to repeat, but they painted a picture of a woman who resented her daughter's existence and who made no effort to hide that resentment. These weren't offhand comments made in a moment of frustration. These were repeated expressions of contempt for her own child. Witnesses told investigators that they'd noticed Eliana seemed underweight and that Cheyenne didn't seem attentive to her needs. Some said they'd considered reporting concerns but hadn't followed through. By the time anyone did intervene, it was too late to save Eliana. The autopsy report was damning. The medical examiner testified that Eliana's injuries were not accidental, that the pattern of abuse was clear, and that the neglect was so severe it constituted a direct cause of death. The broken bones, the malnutrition, the brain injury, all of it pointed to sustained abuse. Cheyenne Hill was charged with child neglect causing death. At trial, prosecutors presented medical evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of Cheyenne's statements about her daughter. They argued that Cheyenne had viewed Eliana as an inconvenience and had treated her accordingly, withholding food, inflicting violence, and ultimately causing her death through a combination of abuse and neglect. The defense tried to paint Cheyenne as a struggling young mother who was overwhelmed and didn't have adequate support. They suggested that perhaps she had postpartum depression or other mental health challenges. They asked the jury to consider that Cheyenne hadn't intended to kill her daughter. But the prosecution countered with the evidence of sustained abuse. This wasn't a single incident of a mother snapping under pressure. This was months of systematic neglect and violence. The broken bones in various stages of healing proved that Eliana had been injured multiple times and never received medical care. The severe malnutrition proved that she wasn't being fed properly over an extended period. And Cheyenne's cruel remarks about her daughter proved that this wasn't a mother who loved her child but was struggling. This was a mother who resented her child and acted on that resentment. The jury found Cheyenne Hill guilty. In April of 2024, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. While this isn't a life sentence, Cheyenne will be in her 50s before she's eligible for release, and she'll spend the prime years of her life behind bars. At the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed Cheyenne directly. He talked about Eliana's suffering, about the fact that this innocent baby had spent her entire short life being abused by the person who should have protected her. He noted that Eliana never had a chance at a normal childhood, never got to experience love and safety, never got to become the person she might have been. Family members gave victim impact statements describing Eliana as a beautiful, sweet baby who deserved so much better than she got. They talked about their regret that they hadn't intervened sooner, their guilt that they hadn't saved her. And they expressed hope that Cheyenne's prison sentence would serve as justice for Eliana, even though nothing could bring her back. Cheyenne Hill is currently serving her sentence at the Indiana Women's Prison. She'll be incarcerated through 2054, missing decades of freedom, living with the knowledge that she destroyed her own daughter. Eliana Hill was 18 months old when she died. She never celebrated her second birthday. She never learned to speak in full sentences. She never went to preschool or made friends or experienced any of the joys that toddlers should experience. Her entire existence was marked by suffering, and that suffering was inflicted by her own mother. The Hill case is a reminder that child abuse often happens behind closed doors, away from witnesses, with victims too young to report what's happening. By the time the abuse becomes visible, it's sometimes fatal. That's why it's so important for communities to be vigilant, for people to report concerns, and for Child Protective Services to have the resources they need to investigate and intervene. If this final case affected you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We've covered 10 cases today, each one representing a child whose life was stolen by the person who should have protected them. These stories are painful, but they're important. We've reached the end of this documentary, and if you're feeling emotionally drained, that's understandable. These aren't easy stories to hear. They represent some of the worst failures of maternal instinct and human decency that Indiana has ever seen. 10 mothers, 10 sets of crimes so heinous that they resulted in life sentences or the functional equivalent. Brandi Worley, who stabbed her children to death out of spite during a divorce. Caylin Monroe, who forgot to feed her baby until he starved. Sophie Igou, whose toddler wasted away in filth and neglect. Gertrude Baniszewski, who tortured a teenage girl to death in one of the most notorious cases in American history. Tenisha Echols, who was given a second chance and immediately squandered it. Keiara Bickett, whose negligence with a firearm cost her toddler his life. Pasztor, who smothered her children to keep them safe. Chelsea Crossland, who subjected her son to 74 days of torture. Chantell Gardner, who abandoned her daughter to die alone in the cold. And Cheyenne Hill, who abused her baby while making cruel remarks about her future. These 10 women have something in common beyond their crimes. They will all die in prison, or they'll be elderly before they see freedom again. The justice system has determined that they're too dangerous, too broken, too evil to ever be released back into society. But more importantly, these cases represent children who deserved better. Tyler and Charlie Worley, Silas Monroe, Jasper Igou, Sylvia Likens, Daria Echols, and the children Tenisha continued to endanger. Javarius Bickett, Liliana and Renee Pasztor, Christian Crossland, Skylar Gardner, Eliana Hill. These children's names should be remembered. Their lives, however brief, mattered. And their deaths should serve as a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more willing to intervene, more committed to protecting the vulnerable. If you suspect a child is being abused, please report it. Call your local Child Protective Services. Call the police. Make the call that could save a life. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't worry about being wrong or overreacting. It's better to make a report that turns out to be unnecessary than to stay silent while a child suffers. Thank you for watching this documentary on Cold Case Time. If you found this content important, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime content that matters. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. These stories are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but they're essential. Because every child deserves protection, every victim deserves to be remembered, and every crime deserves to be examined so we can learn from it and hopefully prevent future tragedies. I'm your host, and this has been 10 Most Evil Indiana Mothers Who Will Never See Freedom Again. Stay safe, look out for each other, and remember, if you see something, say something. It could save a life. Until next time, this is Cold Case Time.